Ever since Pope John, I think the world is concerned, enthused, exhilarated, and wondering too about ecumenical developments in Rome and how it affects the rest of the world, non-Catholic as well as Catholic. And around the table are four theologians, two Catholic, two non-Catholic. Gordon Zahn, who teaches sociology at Loyola University, author of the remarkable book just issued, The Martyrdom of Franz Jägerstätter and Solitary Witness. Richard Carbray, who teaches classics at Rosary College. Our two Catholic theologians, and Dr. Howard Schomer, who's been a guest on this program several times before, the president of the Chicago Theological Seminary, and Dr. Joseph Sittler, professor of theology at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And there's a man whose name seems to be in the minds of a great many people involved and concerned, and I say excited by ecumenical development. His name is Archbishop Roberts, who appeared on this program last summer it was. And Archbishop Roberts perhaps might be described as the man in the middle, a man of very definite humane, humanitarian 20th century views. And perhaps we hear his voice. He's discussing Pope John and the theme of war in the 20th century.
Of course, is so absurd about the war is that in this particular case of war, each nation is judge and executioner in its own cause, a principle which seems opposed to the essentials of justice. And so it is the chief point, really, of the encyclical of Pope John, that all Christians should, and indeed all human beings, should throw themselves heart and soul into the ideals of the United Nations, into things like the Declaration of Human Rights, and as far as they need correcting, as obviously they will, then they should give the same kind of frank and informed constructive criticism as anybody in a democracy gives to his own national government.
Well, Father Roberts, do you sense within the Church then a trend on, do you find that you are having more allies? You spoke of some justifying Pope John's encyclical justifying nuclear war in some convoluted way. Do you find if I may, the position that you have becoming more and more strengthened within the Church?
It's growing, but slowly. I would say that, certainly I would say without hesitation, that I found more intelligent appreciation of Pope John's encyclical among Protestants than among Catholics. And that's a paradox. But a paradox, I think, that the Pope would have welcomed. I think.
Yes, the question of paradox in life itself. Other aspects. And thus we come to just one aspect of Father Roberts' comments that caused a great deal of discussion. Well, Gordon Zahn, and you and Dick Carbray, as well as Dr. Schomer, have been to Rome, and you've been an observer, I know. You've been in Manchester, commuting from Manchester to Rome. What are your feelings of Father Roberts' position today?
Well, I would say I endorse his position wholeheartedly. My purpose in going to Rome was to do what I could to help him work up an intervention that he intended to make on behalf of conscientious objection with relation to the schema on the Church in the modern world. At the present time, there is sort of an endorsement of the licitness of conscientious objection in the adnexa, or the appendix commentary to the schema, and it's Archbishop Roberts' feeling that this is a bit too mildly worded and that it belongs in the schema itself. And this is really the gist of the intervention that we were preparing when I was there. It's my impression that, as he points out, his position on nuclear war particularly, and if we follow through with Cardinal Alfring's comments on the idea of modern war itself, is gaining support and gaining respect and influence. It is by no means the majority opinion yet, or at least to an American's eyes it isn't the majority opinion, but it may be much closer to that than we realize from our particular perspective.
Well, perhaps we can return to this theme later on as we go around, the theme of developments, trends, can there ever be a going back? Howard Schomer, I know you as a Protestant have been very involved observer of the scene. Your feelings in hearing just a segment of Father Roberts' talk.
It's characteristic, I suppose, of all church groups to work very hard updating their basic positions on practical problems, and always to do so about 25 or 30 years too late. My greatest fear for the effort that Archbishop Roberts in many respects champions at the Vatican Council is that the Roman Catholic position, which hitherto has been to say that the Christian can conscientiously support war when it is just, and in fact must do so when he is enjoined to do so by duly appointed authorities, will reach no further state of mind, no further stage than to affirm that if there is a tiny minority in the church that sees things otherwise, it is not in mortal sin. And this would be far too late and far too little with respect to the problem of war and peace and individual responsibility in the nuclear age.
Dick Carbray, Rosary.
Well,
I know you know Father Roberts personally. You've been very close to him.
Well, I spent several months with him in the United States and 7 weeks with him in Rome. And incidentally, Studs, I'm afraid I'll have to as Sam Golden would say, include me out. As far as a theologian is concerned, I was essentially a Latinist with the archbishop in Rome. And although it wouldn't surprise me at all, having seen Gordon Zahn's latest book on Franz Jägerstätter, that he is a sociologist cum theologian, but I'm afraid I'll have to excuse myself from that learned company.
Let's say as a non-theologian.
As a non-theologian, I would say that it always it seemed to me that Archbishop Roberts was struck by the matter of a hierarchy of problems in the world today, and that the overriding problem is peace. We can have collegiality, we can have St. Joseph in the Mass, in the liturgy, but if we don't have peace, then we'll have little else. And I think if there are those who think he's preoccupied with this problem of war and peace, I, for one, share his preoccupation, and that's how I happened to become associated with him in the first place. Now, on his intervention that I had the pleasure of translating into Latin, he wound up by saying, "For the sake of united action with our separated brethren, but much more in reparation to Christ, the Prince of Peace, whom we have so grievously failed throughout history, I beg the Council to show the world that our concern for freedom of conscience is not a matter of theory only or of expediency, but of real devotion to that freedom with which Christ has made us free." And those almost poetic lines, I think, sum the Archbishop up rather well. Then he too thought that there is a great difference between tradition and traditionalism, and in fact he might have put it this way, that traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, and valid tradition is the living faith of the dead, and that in trying to get the stance of the Church off dead center, he was encouraging a dialogue, and I think he's succeeded in that, don't you, Dr. Schomer?
Oh yes, he is one of the most open and candid participants in the whole rapprochement of Catholics and Protestants. We were very grateful for his visit to this city last June, and I'm sure that not only with regard to conscientious objection and war and peace, and one of his other great concerns, family planning, the right definition of the Church's position on this matter today, but with regard to the general underlying principle involved, namely the authority of the Church and the responsibility of the individual Christian, we couldn't have a more stimulating dialogue partner than Archbishop Roberts.
Dr. Sittler, I know you, too, as a Protestant theologian, have been observing the scene, and I know that there are many things Father Roberts says to which you subscribe. What is your, just to start, and later we'll toss this open for discussion, of course, rather than questions, answers, discussion.
Well, to begin at the point of the apprehension that was expressed by Dr. Schomer, I share that apprehension. I see why he has it, and I'm afraid it's well-founded. However, when we observe that by changing an old formulation of traditional dogma so as to make the abstention from an action not a mortal sin, This indeed looks like a very small part, and if that is all that happens, that indeed does not augur a vast change in Catholic faith and life. But we know from the dynamics and the strange structure of the Roman Catholic Church that when that small propositional change is made, the actual interior life of the Church may flow through that small hole if the moment is right and if the people are there to push it through, so that a very small change in language can inaugurate a very large change in actual teaching, canon law ultimately, and private decisions of conscience. So that while I think Dr. Schomer's apprehension is logically well-founded, historically one could find a basis for promise too, because many times in the past a shift of a syllable has had fateful consequences in the history of Christian doctrine, and maybe this will be some such shift, because I think Mr. Carbray is right. This is the problem, and the weight of the problem applied to that small hole may emerge with more of a deluge than we see now.
And this is a particularly crucial lock or something like this. All of these controversial positions that are attributed to Archbishop Roberts, his stand on contraception, for example, as well as on war and so forth, revolve around his insistence on a new recognition of the rights of freedom of conscience, that the individual's judgment is not to be bound in advance by some fixed, closed blocking, such as the natural law, just applied without question. He says that he doesn't deny authority in his thing, but he's always saying it should be a rational assent to authority, not this blind assent to something.
Could I ask a question here?
Please.
On the basis of your experience last fall with the Council, when they opened the debate on freedom of conscience and the conscience and the civil order and so forth. Now, to be sure, they did not close it, and the discussion goes on next fall. But had you enough experience of the way the tide is running to wish to project now how the fathers of the Council might feel? Is the tide in the direction of Archbishop Roberts' feeling and statements on this matter, or would you not wish to guess on that?
Well, I was only there for 8 days. Dick was there much longer and probably can answer better. My impression, though, judging from the row they had at the end, when it was not brought to a vote, and so many wanted it to be brought to a vote, that I think definitely this is the way it is moving. And perhaps this too may have been one of the mysterious workings of the Holy Ghost, by the fact that there were such tactical restraints imposed upon a great number of the fathers who did want to vote on something. It may well be that they will come back all keyed up a little more intently than they were before to carry this through to final affirmation. How do you feel about that?
Well, I showed Dr. Schomer and Dr. Sittler something that was scribbled on an envelope that was sent to me by a non-American prelate that fateful November the 19th, when the freedom of conscience was not allowed to come to a preliminary vote. I think that's what many people don't understand, that it was a preliminary vote. It wouldn't have been promulgated this session in any event. But I do think that the tide is running in Archbishop Roberts' favor. It certainly is among the Americans, the Americans that I talked to, that there will be the next session, and rather early in the next session, not only a vote, but a vote overwhelmingly in favor of freedom of conscience. And the non-American prelates that I encountered in Rome, and there were many, seem to share the Americans' concern that this is long overdue. A forthright, comprehensive statement on the inviolable nature of the human conscience, the individual human conscience, and that there can be no delaying on this, or there can be no weasel words or putting it off, that the time has come, and that time is now, and it's just unfortunate that it wasn't voted on in the waning days of the Council.
I think perhaps if we can the freedom of conscience being the overall theme. Perhaps now, if we can specify it even more, Dr. Schomer used the euphemistic and very diplomatic phrase family planning, let's say birth control. We know this theme. Now, Dick Carbray, speaking of the American representation, wanting to widen the aperture that Dr. Sittler spoke of, birth control perhaps, and even discuss perhaps the what seems to be the dominant American Catholic approach. You feel this is changing. I know Father Roberts is very definite, is he not, in his being a proponent of facing the problem of population explosion.
Well, Studs, excuse me, Gordon, I think something should be said at this point. I had written something down for local publication about what Archbishop Roberts was trying to do. And this is what he was essentially trying to do, as I understand it, that he was trying to get the church off dead center and to start discussions without his prejudging what the end would be on those discussions. He thought that there were matters of first importance that had to be discussed. And I note a comment of Father Herring's, who said recently, "These solutions on disputed questions do not come down from heaven." This was in the matter of whether Pope Paul last June put a complete prohibition on discussing birth control, or whether there should be continuing discussion on all levels and many degrees of competence, lay people, prelates, theologians, sociologists, married couples, doctors. And it would seem that Father Herring, in saying, quote, "These solutions on disputed questions do not come down from heaven," they do emerge out of a give and take of having the best minds in the church at any given time grappling with a given problem. And so I think Archbishop Roberts, in fairness to him, I think you'd have to say that he's not trying to play Pope in any way. He's simply strongly urging that there are problems, and I'd like to hear Dr. Sittler on this, problems, for instance, involving the natural law. And both Catholics and Protestants have a very real interest in this matter of the natural law. And up to this point, it's been a very convenient hook on which to hang many things from the Catholic point of view. Doctor, would you like to say something about the natural law?
Yeah, I think that the discussions presently going on, both in the ecumenical movement among non-Catholic churches and within the Council's actions, that these things are sort of like a string in a labyrinth. No matter what issue you get a hold of, if you follow the thing through, you cannot avoid ending up in that central jug in the middle of the whole place in which you have the doctrine of natural law. Now, whereas you quoted Herring, who's a moral theologian, by saying that these decisions do not drop down from heaven, as a non-Catholic, I have the impression the place they do drop down from has in general Catholic practice as great a solidity as heaven has. That is, the tradition of natural law and the role in the formation of Catholic theology, both theology proper and moral theology. Now, this is really the log on which we have to sit and talk, as well as the log over which we have to stretch this issue if we're going to crack it. Because by natural law, I think we would agree on a working definition. By natural law, we mean that God the Creator has so structured his creation according to law that the way in which men fashion their life must pay due regard and primary regard to these laws built into nature. And these laws are intelligible laws, they are divine laws, and they are knowable laws. And insofar as man knows them, he is under holy obligation to obey them. Now, from that theological presupposition, we now face ordinary, day-by-day, familial, social, educational, and personal, private, moral issues. We bring these under the illumination of a theology of natural law and ask, what light does God's law throw upon this? Now, it seems to me that Catholic theology has got to move to the point where it understands that when man stands equipped with technical knowledge for probing into the structure of nature, he is a different man and thinks different thoughts than the man who stands fairly ignorant before the world of nature and has not the technical knowledge to open, to some degree, her secrets. And the philosophy of natural law was really developed before the period of the Enlightenment and the refinement of those instruments for seeing the infinitely far and the infinitely small and making refined measurements of the structure and process of the world. Can the concept of natural law remain unchanged for the man in the technical age whose own selfhood is so deeply determined by his daily transactions with this world that if you talk about the modern man as if he were not thus determined, you're not talking about any intelligible human being in the 20th century any longer. And this is a great problem for Catholic theology, and I should like to suggest that there are changes going on in Catholic theology. I do not understand natural law tendencies in theology as being one of the irreformable doctrine. It is a theological pattern which has an enormous and a distinguished history back of it, but it is not the only legitimate Catholic way to do theology.
This is true. And even those who are still writing in the Catholic tradition of the natural law theology have sort of opened their discussions, their thinking, to these new considerations in terms of family planning, the population explosion, and so forth. You omitted the psychological sciences in this, and here, thanks to the sociological, psychological sciences, we now know so much more about the nature of the marital relationship and so forth, that this now has to be taken into account too in determining to what extent this may or this may not be permitted and so forth. Actually, I think Archbishop Roberts would, if forced to it, be somewhat more conservative in his resolution of the problem than many of the other priests who are talking about it at this particular time. What makes him so much a controversial figure is, of course, here's a bishop saying we must open this discussion and pursue it a bit further. And secondly, it's this blasted insistence of his on the conscience must decide. We must have freedom of conscience.
Isn't it also a fact, Dr. Zahn, and perhaps Howard too, that the fact his see was Bombay. He was in India, and there he saw the most almost horrible caricature of population explosion. Mm-hmm. And being a man on earth as well as an unworldly, what's the phrase to use, the theological phrase for the religious man, the non-worldly as well as worldly observer, he saw what the non-family planning was. Wasn't the fact he was in India? Surely this is not accidental that he saw this, the horror that was happening, the population explosion.
No, he uses that as illustrations.
He does. And Pope Paul, incidentally, saw what Archbishop Roberts had seen for 13 years as Archbishop of Bombay. But Father Hans Küng reminded us at Rosary a few weeks ago of something I suppose we shouldn't have to be reminded of, that there really shouldn't be a theology in the Church, in the Catholic Church, that there can be theologies without there being heresy. We have Dominican mindsets, we have Jesuit mindsets. But this reminded me of a little conversation with one of my gifted students who wrote a paper on St. Augustine, and she said, wouldn't St. Augustine have made a great contribution to the Council? And I said, I'm not so sure. If St. Augustine had lived consecutively from the 5th century up through the present day, he might have. But given that St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, I'm not so sure that he would have. He would have brought a gifted mind to the Council, but he would have brought his 5th century predispositions to the Council also. He wouldn't have had the benefit of the intervening theological insights. And so I think for some Catholics, if it's suggested that St. Augustine did not say the last word, nor did St. Thomas, nor did Robert Bellarmine, that as Newman has made it clear, theology is not a static thing, it's a dynamic thing. And so I think sometimes we become wedded to and indulge in little hero worshipping as far as these monumental, these Olympian figures in the Church. Don't you think so,
well,
Dr.
has
Sittler?
any Catholic theologian and I really don't know, I really want to know, has any Catholic theologian asked seriously whether or not there really is such a thing as natural law which is knowable? I mean, you listen now to a theoretical physicist who says, and I quote, "We now know enough to know that there is no necessary connection between the thoughts in our minds and the way things are. That is, that all physical theories are hypotheses that have a modular character. For tactical and operational purposes, this is the way we shall suppose that things are. But now, if the way things really are, which would have to be known in order to use the word law properly, this is really not known. The interior structure and process of material, the way the behavior of light, and certain problems, sir, in social relations, maybe they're not only not known, but they may be not knowable, and therefore natural structures and processes, but not the dignity of law." Now, if we assume that, it seems to me we put a large question mark over the hegemony of a theological method which proceeds from a natural law position. Because look what we're doing to the law of nature. After all, God didn't make the little atoms to be forever folded in upon themselves with no other possibility, because we now know if we bounce one off against another, we're interfering with the law of nature. Now, the moment we start interfering with Aryomason as well as atomic science and astronomical science and pharmaceutical science, just at what point does interference with the law of nature become an evil, and at what point can it must it also be weighed as a potential for good?
I'm glad that Dr. Sittler put the accent on the word process early in his last remark, because the question has been raised and must be faced: how natural is human nature? What is the concept nature itself worth in contemporary scientific thinking? Not simply the concept of natural law in philosophical thinking, but the implication that when you pronounce the word nature, you are referring to something that exists and is given outside of your own mind, and the further implication when you say natural law, that there is in that given fixed reality, nature, a structural plan which could be discerned with sufficient work by the human mind and be called a law. All of this is really up for grabs in the contemporary scientific situation. And we're much more inclined, are we not, and I think this would be true of vanguard Catholic theologians as well as Protestant theologians, to speak in terms of the imprinting upon the raw material of the universe of a design that corresponds to our human concepts of value. Then we are to continue to insist upon a value, a plan, a structure inherent in some objective nature, which our human minds need but discern. So in Bombay, Archbishop Roberts, like many others, could observe that for 50 centuries or more, people have accepted as natural a life expectancy somewhere between 25 and 28 or 30 years of age, could expect and accept as natural an unlimited number of children, of whom a very large proportion would die of starvation or of disease taking its natural course. But theologians as well as scientists today have to say simply there is the process of procreation. There is the process of conception. There is the process of birth. But the human organism, man and woman, that carry this process and potentiality jointly, are themselves in process of evolution. And what they shall yet become is not already given and clear in the natural world itself. This depends on the values that they observe, and this depends upon the decisions which they take in this realm as in many others.
Chardin came to grips with this, maybe not in precisely that way, but in projecting what we would be as men several millennia hence, and using such terms as a world soul. Don't you think that he was saying some of the things that you have been saying?
He was one of the vanguard, precisely Catholic theologians and scientists whom I had very much in mind. And I think that theology after Teilhard de Chardin cannot be the same as it was before. For he is forcing us to think more consciously, perhaps than hitherto, though we had begun to do so, in evolutionary terms about such a concept as human nature, and evolutionary terms likewise with regard to our own moral theology, by which we would urge certain decisions rather than others upon male and female and upon societies, the war-peace question.
What's a sociologist? Has the same kind of process as being a parallel body of data alongside the old law of nature. What influence is this having on the development of sociological method and thought about these problems?
Well, I would say it's certainly having some influence, but I think the influence is probably the other way around. I think it's the growth of the social sciences and the impact of people who have been thinking in terms of social sciences that are really pushing pushing consideration of the weaknesses, the inadequacies of the old fixed formula type of thing, that we are introducing new factors. Well, if these fixed formula were true, how come this, And so I think this is one of the contributions the social sciences are making to the field of theology, and I'm going to beg off the theologian tag at this point, too, before you get a host of objections on that.
Is it safe to say, following Dr. Schomer's comment, that ever since Chardin, Catholic theology cannot be the same, that the Catholic Church itself in these matters cannot be the same since Pope John?
Oh, I think this is unquestionably the case. Of course, the question is whether the Catholic Church can ever be the same at any time. It is a living institution as it exists in the world, but certainly I can't think of anybody that's had as much impact on it in so short a time as Pope John.
Well, did he have that impact as a personality in a brief papacy, Gordon Zahn, as you see it, or did he but have the intuitive insight and the courage to open the dam so that a great pent-up power for renewal, reform, and creative thinking that was already there among the theologians and intellectuals of Catholic France and Germany, for example, could flow out and affect the somewhat more insular church here in America and in Spain and other countries that we might name?
I don't think the second could have happened that easily without the first. I think it is this man's emotional, personal makeup that does it. We tend to think of him all too often. Dick and I have discussed this before, and he'll want to pick this up, I'm sure. As the simple peasant who got up there somehow, and just because he didn't know all the niceties and the careful ways of going about things, really ripped everything apart and let all these new forces flow. I think he was
the forces that were always within, that were damned,
yeah,
always there.
And I'm sure he was perfectly aware of this. I don't think he's this naive little creature in Potsdam Terrace that Paul Ramsey and others see him as being, the man who just doesn't know anything about power who can write this. I think he knows about power. I don't believe a man becomes pope without knowing about power to begin with.
Or live as a papal delegate in Paris that long without and remain naive. I don't think so.
It's the directness and the simplicity and the cutting away of all the frills and trimmings and cautions that mark Pope John. I think Archbishop Roberts has a lot of this.
Yeah, you have to be very sophisticated to be that simple. I think that's about it.
Right. Well, George Lawler, who's at St. Zav's and edits Continuum, I go down to visit with him occasionally, and we take long walks around the grounds, and we were chatting one day about maybe God was trying to tell us something, that whereas the Christian world, which is over against the world generally, is rather minuscule in point of numbers. There are many more pagans than there are Christians. But for the first time, really, when Pope John died, there was true world Weltschmerz, and we were wondering aloud if men like Roberts and Pope John, if God, in fact, wasn't trying to tell us something, that whereas we do need systematic thinkers who can intellectualize anything and play at times intellectual games, we also need, as Joe Sittler pointed out, people who have a degree of sophistication that allows them to be simple in the best sense of that word. And I know, looking through a briefcase for some of the vast correspondence that Archbishop Roberts receives from around the world, he's not the world's best housekeeper, and understandably so, because he gets so many letters. But I think what he accomplishes, and somebody like Pope John, and I would be interested to know if you agree, there's a holy joy about both those men. Is that a good expression? Holy joy? Because if we're all in pursuit of sanctity, I think we don't have to do it with long faces. And Pope John had a sense of humor. Archbishop Roberts has a delightful sense of humor. And I've seen Joe Sittler, a theologian par excellence, display an equally fine sense of humor. So in this pursuit of sanctity, there seems to be no law against bringing good humor and, as I say, this holy joy to the task. Don't you think so, Joe? Right. Right.
I think, in view of the developments, that obviously it seemed to be the case that there can be no turning back, though there may be a temporary setback. The point that Dr. Sittler made earlier, even that little aperture, the little opening, seemed to turn of us. Indeed, seems to presage something much broader. Thinking in terms of America today, we hear of young priests who do something unprecedented in challenging a cardinal on the West Coast, for example, Father DeBay, or a new arrival to Chicago, I trust is welcome, Father Caulfield. This could never have happened in the matter of human relations and black and white relations. This ever happened prior to the time of Pope John, this challenging of a high clerical figure?
I don't think, I think it must have happened, but I think what is different, since the time of Pope John, these things get publicity within the Catholic community. And I'm sure that previously it would have just been something that would have been put in a drawer marked miscellaneous, and this would be the end of it. But here we have a situation, partly I think this is just the experience of these bishops sitting together in the council and seeing that by virtue of being a bishop does not make one a superman. And therefore you do have criticism voiced in Catholic diocesan papers of high-ranking prelates. This is absolutely new.
Could I ask a question of Professor Zahn? Is American Catholicism sufficiently over its the wounds imposed upon it at the time, the beginning of the century, when the modernistic controversy took place and all that? Are they sufficiently now secure that they can, like a good secure tree, wave in the high wind without worrying? I think this is a very important psychological and sociological fact to know, that when, for instance, the vernacular is used in the Mass, whether or not this is taken with a kind of mature, grown-up attitude on the part of the contemporary Catholic common life depends a good deal upon whether or not they feel a minority or chaste, misunderstood, or whether they're big boys now in the American community and can dish it out and take it in the give and take.
Well, I think they're still concerned about their standing in the overall community, but certainly not so much anymore that they have this complex about not looking strange, not doing something that might be open to a challenge or something. I think we can wave a little more than we did in the breeze. We're not quite yet as flexible probably as we should be. There will always be this, well, what will the others think, you know?
Well, all my experience, Joe Sittler and Gordon Zahn, is that in the last 3 years, Roman Catholic theologians and intellectuals exhibit far more flexibility and, yes, real joy studs in the development of their arguments and the variety of points of view that they are free to express, apparently without any anxiety about discipline within the order or within the archdiocese, than a good many of our Protestant theologians, who may be without external authority, simply hidebound and hard-shelled. And I would like to see a parallel development on two fronts. The liturgical renewal within Catholicism will take some time, as we all know, to be enter fully into the practice of the parishes. People are still going to stumble for a while over unfamiliar usages. But when that first period is over, I should hope that a really joyfully sung Mass with all the congregation taking part, and a clearly structured order of service such as the Mass, especially simplified as it now is, provides, would have a tonic effect upon many of our free churches that aren't free at all. For they simply have followed without thinking and without theological reflection a wooden form of worship service because they inherited it that way and haven't criticized it and haven't gone in for renewal. But I would like to see also a lot of the present Catholic theologians' joy in variety of point of view rub off on our strict denominational theologians from one end of the Protestant spectrum to the other, so that we can, as let's say, generally speaking, Reformed or Lutheran or Methodist or Baptist people, come clean with a personal point of view.
Well, this suggests a question I'd like to ask to Dr. Schomer, who is a theological educator. Suppose that for the next 20 years this going dialogue goes on, and the considerable, in fact massive, weight of Roman Catholic theological tradition continues to refine, now open and free, its own theological spokesmen. And suppose 20 years from now they say, let us now sit down around a vast table and talk over some things. Who's going to sit on the other side of the table, given the present state in Protestant theological education? This is what worries me, as also being in a theological education business. Are we not so washing out the fundamental disciplines which Catholic theological discourse presupposes in classical languages, in command of the whole reach of church history, in philosophical mastery, even if it's the mastery of the present debacle in philosophy? Are we not washing out the what's in the sub-basement, that we're going to have a few bright fellows on the top floor, but they will soon be smashed, I mean, by the sheer competence of the theological strength of Roman Catholic theology?
I believe the debate has gone far enough already. Don't have to wait 20 years to stimulate some hopeful developments among Protestants. Now, this isn't exactly to your point, but it implies a good deal of thinking of the same type that you've expressed. One denomination of American Protestantism has just set aside a little money and is looking for one or two of the ablest younger theologians, perhaps they are teaching theologians, perhaps they are in the pastorate, that it can find in its own denominational family to free them of all other responsibility and send them to Rome for a year or two to study with the younger Roman Catholic theologians at the various institutes that are there found, in order that they may know at one and the same time what is going on philosophically and theologically in the major Roman centers of theological study, and what is the power situation within the Roman Church. What are the prospects for some of these advanced thoughts that we do hear coming from other, shall we say, farther out centers like Tübingen and Louvain, or over in Austria, Father Anna, to have a chance to see how Roman Catholic hierarchy and Vatican councils, sub-bodies, struggle with the theological thoughts that are germinating in theological seminaries of the Roman order. But one or two men who would be, I hope, in less than 20 years' time, prepared to sit on the other side of the table and understand fully what their Roman Catholic counterparts are saying is not enough. And I know that you, Mr. Sittler, like myself, want to see in the theological curricula of our Protestant seminaries far more rigorous attention given to the let us say, the traditional subject matters, not to allow them to be deplaced or displaced by too much concern for the latest phenomena, let us say, in the psychiatric or sociological fields, if you'll excuse me for the reference to your field, Mr. Zahn.
I would suspect that even this was not entirely unanticipated by Pope John when he called the council. I mean, it's a renewal of the Catholic Church that he's talking about most immediately, but it's his vision did seem to really extend more over what we would call the sum total of Christianity and this type of thing. I think he may have forced.
There's something on my mind. I hope I'm not wandering. Mass in the vernacular was introduced. I forget what it was. Dr. Sittler, Dr. Schomer. English Mass. Remember, I was so excited hearing young Dennis Kirkpatrick's demonstration Mass in English. It said, and I think Dr. mentioned the fact that there can be more participation by the congregation. Perhaps my imagination, but when I attended funerals of Catholic friends of mine in the past, I had the feeling of distance. Something impersonal, and a couple of Catholic weddings. But it seems to me, with something in the vernacular, in the language, I can't help but think of a contrast of Negro churches, of Baptist churches, of Holiness churches, and this incredible individual joy, participation. Do you see this, perhaps, Gordon Zahn or Dick Carbray? Is this possible? Is that within the realm of possibility, this kind of individual participation?
More of it, certainly, and this is the whole essence or the intent of the liturgical movement. I had 1 year in the original wellspring in the States, I guess, of the liturgical movement at St. John's Collegeville, and this is quite some time ago, and they were already talking about this, so I'm quite familiar with all the changes that are being made. In fact, some of them seem rather conservative to me. But how long it's going to take, I don't know. The masses I've attended in English, both in Manchester and here, have not been the riotous affairs that we expect them to become. You have people mumbling the prayers and half-heartedly joining in some of the hymns.
It takes a little time.
I have a proposition that I wouldn't want to make, to you as a layman, expect a response by the church, but someday I'd like to offer to some bishop or archbishop a little what I call Operation Infiltration. We have so many Protestants who love to sing. If we could just lend you, let us say, 10 or 15 Protestants for every Catholic parish around the city, around the country, to attend for a couple of months, learn your hymns. There are hymns too, by the way, very frequently. I've attended, and I know. We might just scatter them out in the Catholic congregation and sing real loud, if that would help you get started over this mumble-jumble business at the early phase.
Well, you know, this isn't too humorous. Actually, in Milwaukee, someone sent me a clipping of a Catholic church and a Lutheran church getting together up there so that the Lutheran congregation would teach the hymns to the Catholic congregation. Sure. They actually got together in the meeting, and a relative of mine who happens to be a Lutheran clipped it. I don't know what he was
I must tell you a very sad and funny story. Dateline yesterday, Clinton, Iowa. There was an ecumenical development. Catholics and Protestants got together. 1,000 people turned out, and they all agreed. They condemned atheistic communism, materialism. And I'm thinking, of course, we come back to Ames again.
Yeah.
Of course, ecumenical. This goes back to Pope John again and Father Roberts, does it not?
You know,
Very discouraging, though, isn't it? I mean, that they should get together to condemn atheism, which means they thereby block themselves off from asking, what does the rise of atheism mean in our time?
If it doesn't
this would open the real
lack
problem.
of Christian witness, what does it reflect? But you know, Cardinal Sunens gave a talk this fall on reforming the seminaries. And while he was talking about the things that are so necessary in this reform, I was wondering, and I'm still wondering, Joe, do you think we'll ever come to the point where you, for instance, might be teaching up at Mundelein at the major seminary in the Chicago Archdiocese, or Dr. Schomer might be teaching out at the House of Studies? I think this sort of cross-fertilization could accomplish what you're talking about. In other words, that the people in the sub-basement will be overwhelmed because of what's going on in Catholic theology. That if we are grappling with our, they're really mutual problems, they're Christian problems, if we keep this up, we may find ourselves standing shoulder to shoulder working against the same obstacles, and because we're working together, overcoming those obstacles. So what better way than to share gifted faculty, as you two men would grace the faculty of any Catholic seminary that I am aware of.
Well, like Gordon Zahn's example of Milwaukee, I'm happy to say it's already happening in far more gifted people than any of us around the table, I'm sure. But every Wednesday of January and February, we have the delightful spectacle out on the Midway of 8 lectures each of the successive Wednesdays on the thought of this Jesuit paleontologist, Teilhard de Chardin. Lectures given by one of the prime authorities on the subject from the other side of the water, who happens to be a French Protestant theologian. And the 300 to 600 people who attend,
Crespi?
Yes, Georges Crespi, from all over the Chicago area, I would judge are in about equal parts Catholic and Protestant. There are theologians and students from at least 15 seminaries, Catholic, Protestant, all over the area attending. And we've done other things like this, haven't we, when the Cardinal was here?
I have an interesting invitation from Collegeville, from Godfrey Diekman up there, that as soon as I can get a quarter off, could I let him know? Because he said, now the Roman Catholic clergy are stuck with the job of preaching, as they have never been before. And they use the word stuck with it. I mean, they have a quite negative attitude, as if, how are we ever going to manage this? We haven't been trained for this. And I come from a church tradition in which a very serious attention has been given to the art of preaching to the common life in such a way that the lessons for the day shall be opened up, not just with moral tidbits to live with for the next few days, but the real profound intention of the Word of God. And he asked if I could get a quarter off to come up and do kind of exemplary exegesis toward the task of preaching, not scholarly just to write another commentary, but say, how do you break this stuff up so the ordinary Joe out in front can understand what the lesson for the day means? Well, in my church we had to do a good deal of this, and I did it for a while, and therefore he thought I might be useful in this, and it's a problem of finding the time now.
Interesting.
Well, I hope you do, Joe. I sincerely hope you do.
There's one other aspect that excites me very much. Notice this, you speak of the interchange here, local American ecumenical developments. Magazines, it seems several religious, Catholic and non-Catholic, have come into being that far more outspoken, far more enlightened, it seems to me, far more vigorous than some of our accepted secular magazines such as The Nation, The New Republic, or the Jewish magazine Commentary. I'm thinking of Ramparts, for example, the Catholic magazine, Menlo Park, Motive, the Methodist publication from Nashville. There seems something new in the air that's quite exciting. Is this my imagination? Some of these magazines are religious in tone, yet quite enlightened, very much so. I didn't mean this to be...
You've read it accurately.
I don't think they have much of a mass circulation, but I'll have to get in a plug again for Continuum, which is edited at St. Zav's by George Lawler, and their most recent issue, you'd probably be interested in, Joe and Dr. Schomer, on Father Lonergan, the Canadian Jesuit. The entire issue is devoted to him. And Time magazine, incidentally, this week devotes a page to Father Lonergan. But I think what these magazines you mentioned, Studs, lack in circulation, they certainly seem to be going into the right hands and read by the people who could make the best use of them.
That's right. They interest greatly the theological students and seminarians of today. They have many contributors from the theological faculties. And as the seminaries go today, so go the churches tomorrow. Tomorrow may be a little late. That's the thought I had at the beginning of this hour. Whether we're dealing with a just war or the population explosion, I won't tell you how many babies have been born since we've been sitting around the table. That's not my field. But every one of the themes that we're touching in a leisurely conversational fashion has an extraordinary urgency about it. And this is why we have to look for far more decisive action from every one of our church councils and assemblies, but particularly this very impressive Vatican Council before it folds up its tents and the bishops all go home. Something far more solid and clear as official church position is called for, be it from the Roman Catholic Church or from the World Council of Churches, on the issues that we've been touching today, than I see forthcoming. It's very hard to have mass movements, such as these churches are, and very old ones, that catch up with the times. But if they don't catch up with the times will very likely not continue indefinitely.
Perhaps one last go-around, Dick Carbray, in view of what Howard Schomer just said, the urgency involved, and time working not so much with us as against us, and the church ecumenical developments and the non-Catholic world. Perhaps one last observation on your part. We'll sort of go around.
Well, Senator Morris mentioned that on the Foreign Relations Committee, somebody had suggested that we had to remain in Vietnam because of face. And Archbishop Roberts feels that in some of our more serious problems in the church, that it's essentially a matter of face. We may have gotten out on certain limbs, and in order to get off them gracefully, we have to find the proper formulae so that X number of people can retire with appropriate grace. And I think he's correct. And what a sad rock on which to founder if we have to make matters of faith, either in Vietnam or in the Christian witness, of overriding importance. I think this is truly too bad, and we don't have the time to worry about such matters.
Dr. Sittler, anything? You pass. Gordon Zahn.
Well, I would only say that I too would hope to have something real nice, firm and definitive coming forth from the Council. But even if the worst should pass and there not be something like this, I think that tremendous good has been accomplished just by having positions taken and publicly expressed by some prominent churchmen that have now widened this whole sphere of orthodoxy. Things that I have been saying for some years as a member of the lunatic fringe are now, I think, quite respected.
You and Norman Thomas,
in the
Gordon.
eyes of others, yes.
Howard,
Well,
Dr. Schomer.
I certainly agree with Gordon Zahn's last remark that whatever the councils come out with, individuals have been heard and heard around the world on themes that have been kept under the table too long. I would then conclude for myself that the Church has a very great debt of gratitude, which it probably will not get around to acknowledging, to its lunatic fringe. And the lunatic fringe has a very heavy responsibility to continue to prod the Church, official Church, and to move out ahead of it in the direction that prophetic faith requires.
I can't help but think, listening to our four, I say theologians, indeed I shall repeat that, sociologist, professor of theology at Divinity School, University of Chicago, Dr. Joseph Sittler, Dr. Howard Schomer, head of the Chicago Theological Seminary, Gordon Zahn, professor of sociology at Loyola, and Richard Carbray, teacher of the classics at Rosary College. Somehow, what Dr. Schomer has just said, and what Father Roberts said at the very beginning, too, about we must recognize, someone else said it here too, not so much traditionalists as tradition. And as those we call the lunatic fringe, even in the lay world, the world outside religion, really have something to say. Those in the past we've called fanatics, or those we've called, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke of creative extremism as against the extremism we're accustomed to hearing these days. Christ was the creative extremist between the two other extremists on each side of him. And perhaps this is what is the theme, creative extremism, perhaps the questioning, the questing, and time obviously is working hard.
You know, Studs, I heard more than one prelate, American and otherwise, acknowledge a great debt to our separated brethren like Dr. Schomer and Joe Sittler in the very real help they've been at all the sessions of the Council. Our people bounced ideas off them and could explore things with them and use their insights and their scholarship, their compassion. So I think that when the history of Vatican II is written, that people like yourselves can take a well-deserved bow for being, in a significant way, helpful in whatever success is achieved at Vatican II.
So freedom of conscience, the overall theme, freedom of conscience and ecumenical developments, and thus with exercising this freedom, and also perhaps free ourselves in every way, as men, as women, Catholic and non-Catholic. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Studs.